to another episode of the Cheeky Midweeky, where we are making strength and conditioning not boring anymore. And this episode, we have two doctors talking about something that a lot of strength coaches got to know more about. And we're talking about concussions, we're talking about brain health, and we're talking about how, as strength coaches, we can do our job in our lane. We're not going to dive into how we're supposed to be diagnosing any of this, but just as strength coaches, like how we can do our part and fit in the high performance model. So, gentlemen, go ahead and introduce yourself to our members, and then let's just dive into this bad boy.
Yeah, so we're brothers in Central Iowa. We practice together. My name is Dr. Joe O'Toole, and this is my brother, Dr. Sam.
Yep.
Let's talk, 10,000 foot view, and then we can kind of dive in from it. But concussions, let's start with, okay, why is it that sport coaches, maybe if you're not in football, hockey, rugby, the true collision sports, need to understand that there's still a contact sport? And I remember we had James Frazier on the show, and I'll link to that down below for any of our listeners. But Frazier talked about, for volleyball, there was concussion was one of the highest things that can hold people out. Just kind of talk about, from a macro level, why strength coaches need to be aware of this for their sports.
Yeah, I would say the reason why it's important is obviously there's become more of a focus on concussions in the last probably 5 to 10 years. But as with anything with any student athletes, it really takes a team approach from coaches, from athletic training staff, medical staff, strength coaches, nutritional therapists. There's all kinds of impact that you can pick up from just being around the athletes. And I would argue that strength coaches have some of the biggest influence in an athlete's life. They probably spend as much time as anybody. And so being able to know that person and to be able to just speak into their life. A lot of times athletes are really scared with concussions, whether it's what's the long-term effect, what is this going to hinder me from being on the field? I don't want people to know about it because then I might get held out. And so as a strength coach, you have the opportunity to be able to, as with any injury, be able to speak into that and help them to understand not only what's going on, but then also what are times when you should take it seriously and maybe sit out for a little bit so that you can actually fully recover.
Now, why is it that they're okay, that makes sense. As a strength coach, we understand them, but I guess from a bigger global picture, how come kids aren't feeling comfortable to be able to talk about this? How come, what is the barrier? What is the problem about just a kid being able to be hey man, my head don't feel right? How does that work?
Well, one of the reasons why we got into concussions, and we can share that, just our background a little bit if you want.
For sure, go dive into it. Let them know.
Because Dr. Sam had a concussion in high school, and that was kind of back in the barbarian days when they didn't really talk about it.
See it, it's not an injury.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and just to go into that a little bit, so playing football, playing middle linebacker, guys out on a swing pass, I read it, I'm going to light up the running back, okay? Well, our free safety comes flying out of nowhere and just blindsides me, just takes me out. And honestly, to this day, I don't remember any of it. The only thing I know about it is from watching the film. Okay, so anyway, got smoked by my own guy, didn't see it coming. I bounced right back up. Looking at me, you would have had no clue anything happened. Middle linebacker, defensive play caller, so I'm calling a lot of plays. Speaks to the intelligence of my teammates that it took about 5 plays for them to be like, this dude's saying he's playing for the Tennessee Titans. What is going on here? And
he's not a Tennessee Titan guy.
I'm not that level. And I don't know if to this day they're just pulling my leg or if that's what I was actually saying, but I was saying some wacky stuff. But anyway, I was in for the next 5 plays, and I was in on the tackle all 5 plays. So from a motor standpoint, I was functioning great. You would have had no clue that anything happened. I was doing my job. And so finally they call the trainer over and it's hey, he's not right. He's saying some wacky stuff. You need to check him out. And so they did the evaluation, and I didn't remember anything until the next morning. And so there was that level of impact cognitively that I was just completely out of it. And so took away my helmet, and I guess apparently I kept trying to run back into the game. As soon as the defense was on the field, it's I knew I was supposed to be out there, so give me my helmet, I'm going back out there. And so there's a lot of ways that can happen without any awareness from the outside, just observing and looking at a player, that you may see that. So it's really important to understand the full scope of concussions, and we'll talk about some of the phenotypes and various different types of concussions. But being aware of your players and what's happening to be able to do that. So anyway, the whole reason I got into it is experiencing that concussion, and then fast forward, I was starting to notice motor control issues. I was starting to notice personality changes. I was starting to notice just irritability and memory issues and stuff like that. And so once I started seeing the personality changes, the memory function, all that kind of stuff really go down the drain, that's when I started taking it seriously and getting kind of afraid, because, again, that was right at the point that, all this stuff with CTE and all that stuff was starting to come out with NFL and with Junior Seau and a lot of that stuff happening at that time. That's when, for me, it's like, okay, I need to take this seriously, because I'm seeing this happen in myself. And then fast forward a couple months later, playing basketball, ended up having a major cerebellar concussion, led to me blowing out my knee twice. Blew it out, had surgery, rehabbed, came back and played. Within that first week of being returned to play, blew it out again. And so all that came back to cerebellar decompensation and the concussions that I had the prior season in football.
So he said a lot in there that takes a lot to unpack. So that's kind of, he kind of had that personal story with the concussion. I had one as well, but that was more from an older brother choking me out and throwing me into the concrete floor. That was at home, not necessarily through sports, but so we kind of grew up with a childhood where it was a little competitive. There were 8 boys in the family, so everything became a competition. And so then I played football, got into coaching high school football right out of college, and then I've through the years after graduating with doctorate and everything, still into coaching, and it was just really frustrating to me seeing how your concussion was 15, 16, 20 years ago maybe, and it really hasn't improved since then. And kind of the wake up moment for me was one week we were getting our injury report, and on the injury report, a team of 50 to 60 guys, we had 9 guys on the injury report with a suspected head or neck injury, which is code for concussion because you don't actually put that on the injury report. And so I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, wow, man, we've got a lot of guys out with a suspected head, neck, concussion, and there's something wrong going on here, and they're just not being managed well. And so that was kind of the wake-up moment for me. So that's when we both pursued our postdoctorate in clinical neuroscience, studying functional neurology. We really sought out, okay, who is actually treating concussions, who's on the front lines of concussion rehab, research, all of that stuff. So then we sought out the Carrick Institute out of Cape Canaveral, Florida. So we did our postdoctorate. I just passed my neurology boards this last summer. Sam's going to take them here next year. So that's kind of where we are. And then through that, we're also a little bit of an idealist and like to question the norm. And so in questioning that, all the talk right now is how do you get better at diagnosing a concussion, which is important. There's a lot that needs to be done there. Like Sam said, none of the players knew it. Even the trainer at that point didn't necessarily know. And even as recent as 5-6 years ago when I was on the coaching staff, it was still suspected head or neck injury. And there was not really a good diagnosis. So that's important. But then also, we asked the question, okay, so talking about sports injuries like his ACL that he had after his concussion, there's a lot of emerging research showing there are musculoskeletal injuries post-concussion, a significant impact on musculoskeletal injuries, especially lower extremity. And so looking at that, we're also looking in with strength and training, performance training. They're introducing a lot of preventive types of therapies and exercises into the performance training, such as Nordic hamstring curls with hamstring tears, things like that, where they're finding there's benefits to training to reduce musculoskeletal injuries. that's why a strength and conditioning staff is incredibly valuable, from not just getting guys on the field, but keeping them on the field. And so with that, then we started to take that into the brain and the neurology paradigm and say, okay, is there a way that you can actually reduce your risk for concussion? And so that's when we started seeking out, are there any providers, any training staffs that are doing that? And so we got connected with Dr. Joe Clark out of the University of Cincinnati, and they've been introducing some neurovisual training and various aspects that are showing a huge improvement in reduced rates of concussion. So they're averaging about 20% of the rest of NCAA as a baseline on concussion. And that's been through several years. I believe it's been about 11 years now that they've been doing that. And then 1 year they bumped back up to baseline because they had cut the training program out and they introduced it back in, dropped back down. So it's showing some really good case studies that they're publishing with that, and now it's starting to be introduced into some of the professional levels. Some colleges are starting to pick it up. When we were training with Dr. Clark, I know some of the NFL teams had training staff there, some of their strength and conditioning, as well as athletic training medical staff. So it's something that is on the verge of, okay, we see that this is the need, but at this point it's mostly done at that ultra high level. You have to earn your stripes, and then once you get there, then now you have access to this elite care. And how many of these high school kids like this guy that, you know, he's out playing Friday night football and he never has a chance to get to that level because of the injury he sustained, the future injuries with his ACL, all of those things. So that's kind of what our focus is how can we bring this from this elite level and try to bring it to the masses, to the kids that are day in and day out injuring themselves and don't know the long-term ramifications of that.
All right. So how do you do that? Like, if you just definitely probe the question, right? Like, as a researcher, you have to be able to identify, okay, what's the reason for it, gaps in research. Like, how do you go about educating coaches that are also professors, or they're teachers, or they're doing other things, and athletic trainers? Like, I just the episode that's getting released this week, my goodness, with Stephen Yorkman. So he's the director of strength and conditioning at a high school in Maryland. So it's like, there's just one of him. There's maybe one or two athletic trainers. Like, how do you do a good job educating the masses on this issue that does, like you just said, brain injuries can result in lower body injuries? How do we help these kids out?
I think a big piece of that is getting the strength and conditioning staff involved. I find coaches, administrators can be a little more hesitant to introduce new concepts in. I found strength and conditioning staff typically is a little bit more forward thinking, and so they're able to speak into things a little bit more, and they also have a pretty good BS meter a lot of times.
At least some of us do. I mean,
at least some, yeah.
Other people, other strength coaches, you might be part of the BS problem with some of the
Sure, right. Well, and part of that might just be
boards across their back and swatting before the game.
Yeah, there's some pretty brutal stuff that still happens, but I think a lot of that might even come just to survival of, okay, if I want to actually make this work, then I can't push too hard, and I just kind of have to be part of the system, and not push. But if there's a genuine curiosity, I find that is typically more in the training side of things than in the medical side.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
and to get into specifics, I think it's that curiosity piece, right? As strength and conditioning, you have to have the curiosity. As the coaches, you have to be wanting to be on the edge and looking into what's new, what's out there. And a platform like this and other ones that are putting this stuff out there are very integral to beginning that conversation of like, okay, here's what we suspect is happening. Let's start talking about it. Let's figure out, A, does it pass the smell test? Does it seem like it would work? And then let's start looking into this. Let's start trying it out, getting in with players. And as we're working on this stuff, how can we be a resource to coaches as they're looking at developing this to where, okay, directing towards research. Here's the research that backs us up, that they've been doing out at Cincinnati. Here's, here's just some of the avenues that we can help with this. And that's really part of what we want to do. And as Joe said, is bringing this to the masses, bringing this into high schools and starting to work with kids at that level. And instead of waiting for it to trickle down from the elite level, because that happens slowly, how do we get this from a grassroots type foundation and get it in with high schools, get it in with coaches? And as kids are coming up through high schools, through some elite programs, training in this stuff, now they have that expectation of, I had this in high school, why is it not happening at the college level? And starting to build it even from that. So I think there's some of this organic conversation that platforms like this and others, where that conversation has to start happening so that there can be awareness around it, and then the curiosity to push that development forward.
How do you handle that, being an early adopter in something that might have some pushback?
Hard head. Like, just kind of an idiot, and it's like, this is what needs to be done. We grew up on a farm in Midwest, right? So farmers are just, we're just going to put the work in. It doesn't matter how hard it is. We're just going to do it. And so kind of that's the mentality that we have to have with this is, we know it's going to be a hard fight. It's going to be a battle. But if you're just transparent and honest and authentic about it, and then you're just willing to put the time in, beat the bushes, get out, talk to parents, talk to coaches, do whatever it takes. That's really what we are doing. Is like, okay, anytime talk about early adopting. Anytime that there's something is discovered in the research realm, in the academic realm, there's a 10 to 20 year lag time between actual adoption into clinical practice. I mean, like, as soon as it...
But there has to be that dichotomy to filter through the bullshit, though, right? Like...
Yes, correct. And that's where there's different ways that you can filter it. You can filter it through longevity, and then you can also filter it through adopting and saying, is this actually working? Are we getting results with this? And so that's where so the initial data is out there. And then even just anecdotally, when we first introduced this into a local small private college here in Des Moines, and so we did that last summer. We took their soccer teams through it, and first game they were on the road playing against another school, and we got this feedback from the coach. He said one of their girls took a hit in the head from the soccer ball, and the trainer from the other team that was providing the care ran over, started assessing her and everything, and told the coach, every single time that he's seen a player get hit like this, they've sustained a concussion. And the player jumped up and was able to go forward, and no issues. Like, it took through all the testing and nothing there. So we're seeing it there. We're seeing it played out. Again, University of Cincinnati has been doing it for 15 years, 10, 15 years. So it's not that it's against science. It's not that it's really far out there. The processes that they're adapting into the performance model has been used on the rehab side for years. But now it's just taking it, and instead of asking the question, how can we rehab somebody, it's how can we get them stronger, better, processing information faster, protecting themselves so there's less risk for injury.
For our listeners out there that might be wondering, what are the different types of concussions? Because we have some aspiring coaches, established, and head coaches, and so maybe a refresher for the established and the heads. But for anybody that's an aspiring coach, what are the different types, and what can they essentially do about it?
Yeah, so there's a couple different types of head injuries. So you have you have mild traumatic brain injury, which a concussion would fall into that category. And then you have moderate and severe, that would be more like blast victims, more military sustaining, or severe impacts. So in sports setting, for the most part, you're talking about a mild traumatic, or MTBI, or concussion is kind of a subset of an MTBI. But then when it comes to that, then there's 7 different phenotypes of concussion. So with that, kind of the acronym is COACH-CV, COACH-CV. And so the different phenotypes are, it could have cognitive function, it could have ocular motor or eye control, it could be affective, mood, behavior, things like that. It could be cervical, so related into the neck and the spine, which I want to come back to in a second. And then the H stands for headaches, C stands for cardiovascular, and V is for vestibular. And so
keep going on this. This is good.
yeah. So that's where even when you're looking at from a rehab standpoint, you want to look at, okay, not just did you have a concussion, now you sit around and do nothing for a couple of weeks, and then now you can go back to play because you don't have a headache anymore. Well, you might still have cardiovascular issues, autonomic function, where you can't shift your fueling resources where you need them to be in your body. And so, or it might be a cognitive, like Sam had more of a cognitive aspect, and then a little bit of the effect where his mood and behavior change. So that's where we're drilling down from a diagnostic standpoint of not just did you sustain a concussion, but what type of concussion, so that then we can actually be targeted with our rehab.
How do you do that then? So for our listeners out there, like, okay, cool, I work with football and they had this type of severity. Like, what are the things that they need to be then doing to be helping their athletes? Quick break from the show to remind you to hit that like and subscribe button. It helps us out and it helps you be notified when we have new content get released. So again, please hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoy this content. And with that, let's get back to the show.
Yeah. So if it's a provider, I would highly recommend looking into getting some training from the Carrick Institute. They're starting to do not just fellowship level training, but they are starting to do some boot camps and things like that, just to help with basic foundational level.
With a K, how do you spell it?
Carrick.
Carrick.
Yeah, so the Carrick Institute. And Dr. Carrick was on the Concussion Advisory Council for the NHL, and he's an adjunct professor at Harvard and Cambridge. He's on the medical staff at Central Florida.
Not smart if you're working at Harvard.
Yeah, right. Yeah, like
You're
you
not
said.
Just letting anybody in the door, like, go ahead.
Well, they let us in, so I don't know, but yeah. So as a provider, I'd recommend looking into that as a resource. Phenomenal, on the cutting edge of clinical neuroscience. As like a strength and conditioning, they do have some for kind of that level, and then for patients, I would recommend looking into a Carrick trained doc, or finding somebody that actually understands concussions, and then also, as a patient, you have to be your own advocate. And a lot of times they're told when you have a concussion, your athletic trainers, they reach the end of their scope of practice by saying you need to see another provider. They're not going to be the provider for you after they rule you out and say, okay, you need to get this taken care of, then we can return you to play. They're involved in that, but they're not going to do a lot of the intense diagnosis and rehab and things like that for most people. Now, at certain levels, maybe. So being your own advocate, meaning if they say, go see your family doc, and you go to your family doc and they say, well, just go sleep for a week, stay off your phone, and then we'll see if you have no more headaches, and then you can go play. If that's the answer you get and it doesn't sound right to you as a parent or as a patient, find another answer. That's not an acceptable answer. So so many of our patients, I try to tell, if I say something that doesn't sound right, question me on it. Go to another doctor or somebody and do some research on it. Don't just take my opinion, and don't do that for any healthcare provider.
Yep. And just to add a little clarity to that, when you're, say you have a suspected concussion or a trainer has diagnosed you with concussion, now you need to go get care. If you're going to a practitioner that is saying, or that is only focused on symptoms, that's the wrong thing to focus on. Okay, because symptoms are going to get better over time most of the time. Okay, it doesn't mean that functionally you're back to where you need to be. So now you may still have functional deficits even though headaches have gone away and you feel better. But if you go back and play with those functional deficits still there, that's where your increase of a follow-up injury, second impact, lower extremity issue, all of those things come into play, is because you've never fixed the functional deficit. And that's, I think, more of what we're saying and what we've seen in our experiences. Oftentimes, people are going and seeking care at just their general medical practitioner, and oftentimes they don't have an in-depth enough understanding of concussion phenotypes and how that's affecting them, that they just fall back on symptom-based care. As soon as you feel better, go back and play. And so what we're trying to do is actually assess the functionality and saying, okay, are you back to a good functional baseline where not only are you safe to return to play, but now you don't have an increased risk of re-injury and down the road complications of that.
So what would you guys then say? Like, all right, pretend I got hit in the head. Like I like to kickbox. I haven't done it in a while. I sparred. I'm pretty sure I was slightly concussed at the end of some of those sparring sessions on the Wednesday and the Thursday. And my sparring buddy, the owner and head coach, Jesse, you know, he would make jokes too, be like, "Oh yeah, my head's concussed." Like, I mean, we were running with our cones overhead, and like I remember the cone like barely touching my head. I was like, "Fuck, that hurts." So, like somebody gets a hit in the head, what are the things that you're immediately recommending to people? Like, hey, is it the whole let them sleep, let them not sleep? Because there's conflicting literature out there about that. So, what do you guys say right away?
Yeah, so there is slightly conflicting literature. The best literature now is starting to say let them sleep. The reason why you wouldn't let somebody sleep is concern for severe response. So primarily death is really the most severe you can get, and that's kind of the concern. And as of now, for the most part, that let me step back. If somebody is projectile vomiting, that means you're laying on the floor, you vomit, and it hits the ceiling. If somebody's doing that kind of vomiting, that's a severe issue. That's an intracranial bleed. Your body is trying to decrease pressure in the head. So if that's an issue, if that's happening, you're going to know it's happening. Okay, that's not something that it's like, I wonder if. You're going to know that. If that's the case, go right to the emergency room. Don't pass go. Don't collect your money. Just go.
That was not happening with me nor anybody. And I feel like most schools, they're starting to preach that message of, hey, let the kids sleep, because at least where I worked, I feel like most athletic departments are doing, concussion awareness, and that does seem to be the growing trend of like, hey, the kids, like, let them sleep. You don't have to wake them up every hour and check on them.
Yeah, and the reason for that is a concussion really is a metabolic cascade, a neurotransmitter metabolic cascade, and sleep is highly important in clearing out waste products from the brain. When you sleep, your brain actually shrinks by about 20%. And so that opens up pathways for the brain to start clearing metabolic waste products. So in the strength and conditioning world, you're familiar with metabolic waste like lactic acid buildup, things like that. In the brain, it's more tau proteins, beta amyloid proteins, things like that, which are markers for Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, neurodegenerative aging type things. But when you sleep, your brain is actually able to start clearing out some of that metabolic waste. And so that's why it's starting to show it's probably better to let the brain sleep and rest, at least in that initial 24 to 72 hour time frame. In that acute time frame, you want to rest, avoid any irritating, triggering types of activities, bright light, electronics, those kinds of things where it can really create a strain on the system as far as trying to adapt to all the sensory input.
That's crazy that the brain shrinks by 20. Like, how did they study that? How was that done? Just in a lab and like?
Probably through fMRI. I'm trying to remember back. But I'm guessing
it's that. Like, that's for sure something. I'm gonna link that down in the show notes, everybody. But like, it's definitely something that I'm super interested in now.
Yeah, sleep is honestly probably the single greatest influence in recovery and health in general.
You're preaching to the converted here, especially most of our listeners being strength coaches. Like, now they'll at least recommend it. They might not do it for themselves. Like, I'm the opposite. I preach it, and I did it for my athletes, and I knew how important it was for my own mental health and for my own like struggles with any other, anxiety, depression. We've had another strength coach, Mike Wadango, talk about how important sleep was. Like, he was having a ton of anxiety and problems, and called a doctor, and they were like, go. Like, I think he said it was take a Benadryl. Like, took a Benadryl, like, sleep it off, or not for nothing, and then woke up in the morning and was like, I feel so much better. Like,
Yeah, and there's a lot of benefits in those initial days of allowing yourself to sleep. And then there's some nutritional components that can play in as well. I'm not a nutrition expert. That's not our area of expertise, but there is a pretty significant impact. Again, if it's a metabolic cascade, the health of your metabolism, including your nutritional components, does play into that. So we have a lot of focus on inflammatory diets versus anti-inflammatory diets. Omega-3s actually are really, really beneficial. We utilize those quite a bit in that acute phase. Vitamin D is a pro-hormone, not a vitamin, and it regulates over 1,000 different genes, including a lot for muscle expression. So there's a lot with vitamin D as well. Most of just the basic core nutrition, avoiding a lot of inflammatory seed oil, like processed food type things that can create that inflammatory process as your body's trying to regulate the inflammation, and you're introducing a lot of extra inflammatory markers. That's not good, and there's actually a really strong correlation between concussions and leaky gut syndrome, and then leaky gut syndrome is also related in with leaky blood-brain barrier. So they kind of interact a lot together. So there's some nutritional advice initially, as well as then just rest, let the brain recover from the insult.
How important is neck strength in preventing these concussions, or doing any of the different training programs that you guys have? Because to our listeners out there, I've been to their clinic and have toured around for about an hour and a half talking shop with them, and that's how this episode came out, because I thought there was value for me and I wanted to share the value for everybody else. So like neck strength, any of the different tools and tasks that you guys had there at the clinic, like just share that stuff for our listeners out there too.
Yeah, so a couple of pieces on that. Kind of the number one predictive value of whether you get a concussion, like any injury, is whether you've had a previous concussion. Okay, right behind that is neck strength. Okay, and there's two components to neck strength. One is actually looking at the muscular structure. How do we increase muscular tone and tension and creating a stronger neck? And then right behind, or with that, is then the neurological control. How fast and how quickly are you able to process something coming at you, a hit coming at you, and be able to engage the neck musculature, right? Because it doesn't matter how strong the muscles are, if they're not actually activating and engaging, you take that hit, you take that whiplash mechanism injury, and now you have the concussion happening, the concussion injury, that kind of stuff. And so, yes, you absolutely want to work into your program, strengthening the neck, strengthening the muscle, increasing muscle size, tone, all that. But then I would say, and from our standpoint, more importantly, is how fast can you process what's coming at you so that you can react to it. And as Joe mentioned, the kind of anecdotal evidence of that college soccer player taking a hit, she was able to see that, react to it, and properly respond to that so that she could sustain a hit like that without actually sustaining a concussion. Okay? And that's one of the big things that we look at is the neurovisual training. Okay? So how well do you train the eyes to be able to stay focused on a target? How well do you train it to be able to track a target through space? And how well do you increase peripheral vision and then processing within that peripheral vision? Okay?
Say that again for everybody again, the three real quick.
Yep, so it's retinal retention, being able to stay focused on your primary target. Eye tracking, being able to track an object through space. And that may be with the eyes or with the eyes and the neck combined. And then the last one is increasing peripheral vision, the actual peripheral vision that we can see, and then being able to process what's happening out there while being able to stay focused on our target. Because every time we blink, we're blind. Every time we move our eyes, we're blind. So if I'm looking from target A, playing soccer, I have to track the ball, now I have to track my player. Or football, passes coming in as a receiver, I have to track the ball coming into me. I have to also then see where the hit's coming from. So you're moving your eyes, okay? Well, what happens if you can track that ball and with your peripheral vision being able to say, here's where the hit's coming from, and being able to brace for it. So now not only are you securing the ball, are you securing the catch, but you're also being able to brace for that hit coming so that you don't get blindsided and take that whiplash injury. So that's really where, when you're talking about neck strength, yes, you got to do training, you got to strengthen the muscle, but more importantly, you have to train the eyes. You have to be able to see the hit coming so that you can brace for it and have the proper reaction to that response, as we're talking in relation to concussion and concussion prevention. And so that's really the approach that we try to take, is trying to increase or improve those three aspects of eye control so that we can avoid or be able to respond and absorb those hits without getting the whiplash and the ensuing concussion that goes along with that.
Would you say that that's the more detrimental, worst part about it, is the whiplash effect, or is it just the true traumatic, like, which is worse, for lack of a better term?
It depends. There's a lot of variety to that. A lot of it is involved in force vectors, so which direction is the force coming from and how fast. The worst hits are actually angular, so if I'm kind of rotated and it kind of comes at an angle versus a straight head on.
Just sideways,
more rotational.
So think about it this way. You got a water or a towel soaked in water. How do you get the most water out?
Bring it out, right?
You wring it out because you're introducing the most force to that. If you just squeeze it,
Yeah, the
Exactly.
compression force itself, maybe not, but like if you squeeze and twist,
Yes.
and that's what's happening to the neurons within the brain when you, like you said, when you have a rotational component along with the hit, now you're getting that shearing and that ringing force in through the brain, in through the neurons. That's going to have a much more profound impact.
and just hearing us talk right now, I'm like, okay, hey, like, anybody that was listening, or for me personally, like, I could hear you talk about it and kind of like pretend see the brain doing all of that. Like, how do you battle people that are hearing any of this and being like, you're going to make people not want to play football, these dangerous sports? Like, are you afraid of that? Have you heard any of that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So that's kind of back to like my why of why we're actually pursuing this. Why we went to, what is it now, almost 5 extra years of school after our doctorate to learn all of this. It's like I just finished up my 25th grade. So I'm
5th grade. Yeah, you went to high school. You went through the regular schooling twice, and then
Yeah.
a little bit.
And now a little bit, yeah. So I'm 13 years post high school, and why I'm not an academic. I'm not like that kind of guy.
I can vouch for that. He's not very intelligent.
Yeah. I'm not a nerd, is what I'm trying to say. He says it differently, but so the reason why is, for me, football had a huge, profound impact in my life. I actually didn't start playing football until my sophomore year of high school. But it was through playing football that I really started to develop this love for how the human body works. And after my sophomore year, I got beat up pretty heavy on the scout team. This punk little kid that thought he could jump in, and these varsity players are just smashing me. Yeah, exactly. So I went to the library and I checked out all of the anatomy books that I could. I checked out all of the strength training books. I checked out all the stuff that I could. I was in the weight room all the time. I was just fascinated by how this works. And then that's what led me into, I almost went into athletic training after high school, and then kind of the road kind of took me a different route. I've ended up here where I'm kind of doing the same thing, just at a higher level. And so it's worked out for me. But it all started because of the decision to go out for football my sophomore year. And so I find a huge value, not just in learning about the physical aspect of the human body, things like that, but also my confidence grew through that, my discipline grew through that, my ability to relate to people and the social aspect. I mean, there's just so many things. Football has a unique aspect to it that a lot of other sports don't have. The physicality of it, you have to push yourself. It's not an easy sport. Not that any sport is easy, but there's just an aspect for football that's like pulls on my heart. And I've talked to so many kids and parents in the last several years that have made the decision, we're not going to go out for football because of we're scared of concussions. And I don't want that for people. And that's where, looking back in the early 90s, ACL tears were a death sentence. You were done. ACL, you get an ACL tear, your career is over. And now it's, you know what, you may be limited, but it's probably only for a short time. Our rehab and our surgical techniques and everything are so strong now that it's an afterthought. Nobody ever thinks I shouldn't play a sport because of an ACL tear. That used to be the case 20, 25 years ago. Well, that's kind of where we are with concussions is I don't want to play concussion because of the risk for XYZ. And you've got all these documentaries that are coming out and this fear of the unknown that's coming. And that's where, again, coming back to the prior part of our conversation, that's where educating people on, yes, concussions are a serious deal, but they're not something to be scared of. It shouldn't be something that limits you from living life because, let's face it, life is short. It's a vapor and then it's gone, and we have so much to offer as we live our life. And so not living out of fear, but living out of, okay, something might happen, but if I have the right resources and the tools, then we can actually enjoy and grow and learn. So that's really the heart behind why we're doing what we're doing is we want kids to experience what we experience with football. I mean, Sam, yes, he had a concussion through it and he had some issues, but he doesn't have those issues now. I mean, we've been able, even a decade past, we've been able to rehab him from that and get his brain actually starting to work a little bit now. Still debatable, but
Well, the brotherly love of shooting shots at each other. I talked with you guys about my theory in person, but for all our listeners out there, I have this this theory of low level impact to the brain, giving it some said principles with proper recovery is somewhat beneficial for the ability to handle. If you did get like that girl that took the ball off the head, like had she been low levelly exposed to it before with had she got hit in practice before, in addition to neck strengthening in the weight room and all the other training that is done and pairing it with a good nutrition and good sleep, like that could actually help keep you more resilient. To quote my cousin Vinny, does that hold water or is that just complete bullshit?
So right now that's all philosophical is what I can say.
I do that a lot. I have a lot of philosophical like that.
You're one of those smart guys, huh?
Again, I'll throw some shade at myself too. Like, I mean,
or just one of those guys that you can't pin down to an actual. This is what you mean.
Dangerous thought, and I'm like, I don't. I'm sharing it to the world right now. But
Yep.
Fuck.
Yep. So I would say there's not enough data to know.
Correct. That sounds about right.
So I'm gonna hedge my bet and say that, but. But kind of talking through it, so again, you have to, as you're dealing with things that are kind of novel and new and things like that, you have to have a knowledge base to be able to process through it. And what we found is a lot of neurological rehab principles have a lot of similarity to musculoskeletal rehab principles. And musculoskeletal rehab principles have a lot of similarities to sports performance training principles, strength and conditioning training principles. It's just kind of it's more of this continuum, and where on the continuum are you? So that's where we're kind of looking at things that way. There is some consideration that that low level repetitive injury might lead to CTE types of things. Okay, now. So there's some data kind of showing that, but how accurate is that? Again, that's there's a lot of there's some research that's come out that has kind of debunked that a little bit. That CTE is not directly from low level impacts necessarily, because there are some individuals that are showing up with CTE that have never played a contact sport, that have never played any sport. So there are some cases of that popping up. So it's one of those where, okay, there's not enough known about it from that standpoint. Now, the caveat, I think, that's the biggest piece, and the piece that we don't know nearly enough about to be able to make a statement on that, is what is proper recovery. And so we don't have the ability to measure the brain's functionality well enough, and the microstructures well enough to say, okay, you've done this amount of damage, that can create some issues. And if you recover in this specific way, then you create a positive adaptation versus a negative adaptation. So that's where there's not enough known. Now, there is one difference between neural tissue and more muscular tissue. Is neural tissue, when you rupture a neuron, it's cytotoxic to the neighboring cells. So if you tear a muscle fiber, it's not going to create a knock-on effect to other muscle fibers directly. With a neuron, it will actually cause surrounding neurons to rupture when they get exposed to that inflammatory process from the rupturing of a neuron. So that's where you can kind of make a case both ways, but not strong enough really to go either way.
That's fair. I mean, I guess a lot of those are all just theories, but I mean, that's interesting. I had not heard about CTE from low-level exposure. What was the population that had it without playing a sport? Taking a quick break from the show to talk to you guys about our sponsor, TeamBuildr. If you have any online training platform needs, TeamBuildr is the go-to place. TeamBuildr has the ability to integrate with velocity-based training tools. They have the ability to program and have notes and videos for all of your athletes and your clients. This is your number one stop shop. Been using it since 2019 when I was working at Towson. So I've used it, love it. Make sure you check it out. Go ahead, click the link down in the description. And with that, let's get back to the show.
From the couple of cases that I saw, one I believe was a teenager, like a 17-year-old in Canada. And then I'm trying to remember, the other one was, I think, like a mid-40-year-old, just average Joe, kind of a career worker.
Within that, I know a lot of our listeners out there that work in P5 football, some P5 basketballs, NFL and NHL, like the pros and the people that have more money, they have access to float tanks. How important is that on helping out with the concussions, CTE, brain health, all of that?
That's a good question. So when you look at a concussion, you kind of have to look at the two angles, or even backing way up, is understanding the brain and the brain function. Okay. So most of the time, when we look at the brain, I speak with a lot of educators, and they're supposed to be like the professional on the brain, right? Like how the brain works, right? That's the organ they work on. Okay, so as a strength and conditioning person, you should be pretty familiar with muscular anatomy, microanatomy, physiology, all that stuff, right? Teachers should know the brain. Most of the time they don't, right? They know the technique of learning, but not necessarily the organ they're working with. So the lectures that I give is let's understand the brain so you can adapt your techniques better to that. So when we talk about the brain, the question I ask is, what is the brain for? What does the brain do? How does it work? All that stuff. And almost all the time, the examples that people give are motor output, speech, thought, movement, all of this stuff that the brain puts out. In actuality, the brain is primarily a sensory processing integrator. And so there's 10 times more neurons that go from the thalamus relay station up to the cortex, the thinking part of the brain, than come from the thinking part of the brain back down to the body. So the brain is primarily looking at this sensory input, and based on this sensory input and integrating all of this information, then it gives me this good picture of what is the world around me, what is the external environment, what is the internal environment. Now, if I have really good data, now I can process that and create a response to it. Okay?
Let's keep nerding out on like the brain anatomy with these last 15-20 minutes that we got for our listeners out there to get a better understanding, like from a level that a strength coach needs to understand, like talk brain anatomy, talk brain function, for them to then be able to go down further rabbit holes and dive down more, but like from a decently high level, like what are some of the most important things and locations to help out with that?
Yeah, so a couple of the main areas that we look at from that impact is going to be the cerebellum. Cerebellum is heavily important. We'll talk about each one of these in a little bit. The prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobes, prefrontal cortex, and then the brainstem, PMRF. Those are kind of like two big vital areas of the brain, especially when it comes to human performance, if you will. Okay, so those excuse me, those areas are heavily important. And then there's other smaller structures. Your midbrain is heavily involved in eye movements, eye tracking, reflexive eye movements, things like that. But the cerebellum, if you look at the brain, it's divided kind of into two sides, right? And we're starting to understand, okay, left brain controls your right body, right brain controls left body. Okay? So as a generality, now there's crosstalk and all that stuff, but we found through functional imaging that there is more activity in left brain when you're moving your right body. So the way that sensory input from a proprioceptive standpoint comes in, so the muscles, the tendons, the joints, all that information to give you this positional awareness sense, comes from my right side of my body into my right cerebellum. Right cerebellum then sends that up into the left brain. Left brain then figures out what's going on, where am I located, what do I need to do, what kind of response, how much motor output do I need to give. Sends a copy down to the body on the right side, and then also a copy to the cerebellum to match up the signal of what's coming in versus what's going out to create a smooth, coordinated movement. Okay, so those are cross-talking, and then it creates this error detection of, okay, you're undershooting your target, you need to increase that output a little bit more, and so it's kind of talking together on that efferent copy, afferent copy, all that stuff. So too much, sorry.
You're good.
So that's what we're looking at from that standpoint. Then with activity in the left brain, then you increase activity in the left brain stem. Okay, your brain stem is more of your vital areas, so you're talking like heart rate, blood pressure, sweating, all your autonomic functions. So all your cardiovascular types of things. So as I increase activity on my right side, now my brain is saying, okay, now I need to increase activity here to control this. I need to make sure I'm coordinating here properly. And oh, by the way, I need more cardiovascular activity over there so that now I can fuel my muscles to do the movement. So it's a fascinating system, like wonderful design. So it's really cool because our body doesn't have enough resources internally to fuel everything at 100% capacity. So it creates this ability to regulate and shift where we need it, when we need it, like that. So that's what we're looking at. So diving into Sam's injury of tearing his ACL, okay? So if you lose this perceptual input of, okay, where is my lower extremity located in space? If I don't get good sensory, really, really strong, fast signaling going in to the cerebellum, give me exact representation of where my leg is located, then I'm going to create too much or too little of a motor output, and you're going to put yourself in a vulnerable position, or the muscles aren't going to engage fast enough, etc. Right? And so that's why you're prone to increased lower extremity injuries, primarily because they changed sensory input. Not because his muscle was weak, because he had decent rehab. Like his leg was strong. It was able to handle the types of load that they tested him for. But his brain couldn't handle the change in the dynamics of sensory versus motor output. So that's really from a rehab standpoint of, okay, not just making sure is the leg strong, but is the brain adaptable to the sensory input, motor output that needs to happen.
I think for a lot of our strength coaches that are listening out there, like that did give a good synopsis, but also just to kind of help tie it together is like, look, in the strength coach world, RPR, Signal 6, neurology, postural neurology, reflexology, it's all about, again, like you said, better input to the system to drive better output. And
correct.
I think that's one of the biggest things that I took away from what you said there, correct?
Yeah, and that's exactly, and that's really kind of the paradigm shift that Dr. Carrick really brought around. Is he coined a term receptors-based systems or receptors-based therapy, right? Where it's you're focused not on the motor output, not on the cognitive output, those types of things. You're focused on what is the sensory input. Now, you can use that motor output for testing purposes of, okay, if I'm not coordinated on this right side, I'm doing finger, nose, finger test, and I'm looking like a drunk over here, and then right here, I'm like perfectly accurate. Okay, now that's showing us, okay, maybe we've got some cerebellar issues on the right side, so we need to bias rehabbing the right side, bias integration on that right side. And so, but again, it's not just biasing it from, okay, now we need to work on the motor output on that right side, but we need to work on the sensory input. And so we can use that through the proprioceptive system in the case of the cerebellum, things like that.
So go ahead and tease out and talk about the things that you guys have going on over there, because I think it's pretty cool what you've done, and just kind of be able to explain it to our strength coaches out there, so that way they could be, advocating to their other high performance team members and athletic trainers and sports psychologists, the things that you guys are incorporating out there.
Yeah. So what we've done in part is there's a whole lot of this is happening over here and this is happening over here, and we're getting benefits with this and this, and we're trying to create a complete system for it so that it's not just we're helping here or helping here or helping here, right? Because there are some areas that are doing really, really, really well with rehabbing a concussion. There are some that are doing a much better job with diagnosing a concussion or baseline testing. There's some fairly standard return to play protocols. And so the model that we've adopted, we call it our 4 R's. So it's reduce. That's where we ideally want to start athletes, okay? It's like, let's reduce the risk. Okay, and there's enough data out there to say that doing neurovisual training, doing neck strengthening, doing these types of things, getting off your phone where you're just here all the time, but now you've got this visual field where you're working here. Don't just sit like this all day where your head's forward carriage. Put it up over the spine where now you have more reactive time. When your arm is in this range, you have much faster reaction capability, right? Versus if I'm stretched out at my end range. And so if you can create that more centralized. So that's where reducing the risk is the first R. That's where we want to start. Most athletes don't start there. Most of them start on rehab. And so because until it's an issue, nobody deals with it. So, but the first R is recognize. The second is reduce. Reduce, then recognize. So recognize is creating a really good baseline, and a lot of the baseline testing that's out there is insufficient or incomplete. Or not well structured for an athletic environment. So there's some that have components on cognitive, some on balance, some on ocular motor and eye tracking types of things. And so there's some in like all these different areas that you can do. And then the best baseline testing that's out there right now, currently standard-wise, is the SCAT-5 test. The problem with that is it's bulky, it's hard to perform. You do it one time at the beginning of the season, so you get this one data point at the beginning of the season, whether they have a good day or a bad day. It's not really marked if you do it in the morning versus at night. If you just took a big final exam and now you're taking that. So it's pretty rigorous, but it's hard to perform in an athletic environment, and you get one data point. And then after the first 72 hours, the data is no longer really valid as far as diagnosing a concussion. So it's really supposed to be a sideline type of testing, which again is hard now. It takes about 45 minutes to perform. So you do that on the sideline, it's not going to work very well. And most of our athletes, if you're a high school athlete, but by the time you get into your provider, you're 72 hours out. I mean, Monday morning is when you go in. So that's where what we've introduced is actually an app-based system that we license out that was produced for the NHL primarily. And Dr. Carrick was instrumental in developing this. But it takes 7 different neurological testing, puts it into an app, and it's gamified. So now you got these high school kids that are already on their phone, and they're already playing their games or whatever, and they play these 7 different games on their phone that measure reaction time, visual processing, eye tracking, cognitive, short-term memory, long-term memory, long-term recall, things like that. And then it puts it into this database that measures both off of other normative values, and then now if you get them to play multiple times in that first week, you play one time a day for a week, different times a day. Now instead of having one baseline test, now you have 7 baseline tests scattered throughout the day, things like that. So it's a much more rigorous, and then it only takes 5 to 10 minutes after a game Friday night for them to play. So that's kind of that second component. Then the third is the rehab, which we do a lot of in person. We do some telehealth with that. just to help guide even other practitioners of like, okay, you're working with a vestibular therapist. We're going to tie in some of this ocular motor type stuff that needs to be addressed as well along with that. And then the fourth R is return to play, and that's making sure you're actually recovered, not just no more symptoms, but you're actually recovered and strong enough. And typically, if you do the rehab well enough, it cuts down the amount of return to play time. So your symptoms are gone faster. You're able to return sooner because you've done the rehab properly. So that's kind of what we're doing, is trying to address all the areas of a concussion, not just diagnosis or rehab or whatever.
I mean, we could talk about this all day, I feel like. And, you know, to our listeners out there, this is, again, we are strength coaches for strength coaches and, you know, branching out with athletic trainers. Within the entire high-performance model, these guys, they are working in a clinic right now. They have clients later. Like I said, you have to actually be making your skin in the game and you know, earning your living doing what you do to be on the show. So these guys, they got to get back to work. I want to appreciate you guys and say thank you for coming on. Why don't you let anybody know where they can follow you more and be able to get in touch after they listen to this episode?
Yeah, so we have our clinic is in Ankeny, Iowa, a suburb of Des Moines, and we have our website is lifestreamclinics.com, which I'm sure you can put in the show notes and all that stuff. We're also on Facebook with that, and then we're just launching an online platform where we can provide solutions outside of just this geographic area, and so that is neurocaresports.com. Where we do right now, we're offering baseline testing, virtual baseline testing, where you get access to that programming, and then we're launching into some telehealth on that platform with rehab, and then we're working on transitioning that neurovisual training onto that platform, but that's going to take a little bit of time to get there.
Appreciate y'all, man. You guys have a good rest of the day, and we'll be in touch.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.